Good morning. My name is Alex Cooper. I'm a lawyer with the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative, and I'm going to speak to you today about climate change and fiduciary duty. It's a pleasure to be speaking here at the We Are Guernsey Sustainable Finance Week. I'll start by telling you a little bit about what the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative is, or CCLI. We're a collaboration, collaboration between academia, law firms, and civil society entities. And what we do is we focus on existing corporate and securities law and what that means for fiduciaries, company directors, and investors in terms of climate change, biodiversity loss, and other environmental crises. So climate change is something we've been hearing a lot about, and in the last few years it's become a real focus for investors. I'm going to be discussing what climate change means for investors under their fiduciary duties. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about the context, what climate change is and what needs to happen. Then I'm going to talk about how climate change is now perceived as a material financial risk. And then I'm going to talk a bit about what fiduciary duties entail and what fulfilling those duties means in respect of climate change. So to begin with, just to look at two overarching questions. Firstly, what are the risks which climate change poses to companies and investments? And secondly, what does this mean under existing company and securities laws? I think it's important to bear these in mind as we talk about the context of what climate change is and what's going to change in the next 10 to 15 years. So, what is climate change? I take my climate science from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. This is a body which takes effect under the UNFCCC, or United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is important because it means that the United Nations member states sign off on the IPCC's reports, so these influence government policy directly. And the IPCC's latest findings are quite stark. So the key findings are, it's unequivocal that human activities have caused warming of the Earth's atmosphere, land and ocean, that each additional ton of greenhouse gas emissions increases climate change and increases the effects of it, that climate change increases the severity and intensity of extreme weather events, such as heavy precipitation, droughts, fires and heat events, which we're already starting to see, as well as gradual onset impacts such as sea level change and ocean acidification. Climate change has already caused irreversible changes to land and marine ecosystems, and we're starting to see those impacts filter through to businesses. So we're seeing decreased agricultural and fishery yields, as well as impacts on tourism. So what do we do about this? And again, from the IPCC, there's a few key numbers which is important to bear in mind. The IPCC says that we can limit the effects of global warming if we limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial times. To put that in context, we're currently at around 1.1 degrees C. The IPCC has also found that the effects of global warming get much worse around 2 degrees C. And though that goal has been enshrined in the Paris Agreement, which the United Nations member states have agreed to. So that's taking action to limit global average temperature increase to 2 degrees and to take efforts to strive for limiting it to 1.5 degrees C. That latter target, the 1.5 degrees C, being recently reaffirmed at the COP26 Glasgow Climate Pact. But there's a long way to go. The IPCC Working Group 3 report, the most recent report, has found that the policies that are currently enacted are likely to lead to warming of 3.2 degrees and that we need to peak emissions by 2025, halve emissions by 2030, and reach net zero anthropogenic emissions, so a balance between anthropogenic emissions and sinks, by 2050. So lots needs to happen in the coming years, and we're starting to see government policy reflecting these findings. Okay, but what does all this mean for company directors and investors who are thinking about their fiduciary responsibilities? To understand this, we need to think about what these impacts and what these effects mean in terms of finance. So climate change is now increasingly recognized as a material financial risk. It's not just me saying this. According to the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, Environmental risks are 5 of the 10 most severe risks facing the global economy this year. And it's actually, environmental risks have actually been in the top 5 over the last 5 years, since 2017. And that's despite the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and other global crises which are emerging. Investors are also looking at this as well. So in June 2021, 450 investors with over 41 trillion US dollars assets under management, which is around 10% of all global wealth, signed the 2021 Global Investor Statement to governments on the climate crisis and said that they urgently are seeking to decrease their exposure to climate risks as part of their core fiduciary duties. So I'll talk a bit about what climate risks are and how they manifest. So these 3 categories are physical risks, transition risks, and legal risks. And these have been sort of the benchmark which climate risk has been categorized under since Mark Carney speaking as Governor of the Bank of England around 2017. There's 2 more points I'd like to make before I discuss those risks and what they look like. The first is that these risks have balance sheet impacts to companies. So these are things which directors should be thinking about and things which investors should be thinking about when deciding how to assign their assets. This diagram is from the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD's report. And I think the key point I want to make here is that if we look at the risks on the left-hand side and the opportunities on the right-hand side, what we see is them filtering through to, at the bottom, income statement, cash flow statement, and balance sheet. And we're starting to see this understanding reflected in guidance and requirements by financial regulators. So the UK Financial Reporting Council has spoken about the need to reflect narrative disclosures on climate change in companies' financial statements. IOSCO's released similar guidance, as well as the IFRS. And the IFRS's new International Sustainability Standards Board and the draft standards which it's produced clearly link climate-related impacts to financial statement, to be reflected in financial statements. So this is bottom line risks which companies need to be disclosing. The second point I want to make is that these risks take effect at multiple levels. We move from entity-specific risks, where you might see a particular risk impacting a particular company, to sectoral risks, where a risk could impact the way an entire sector operates, oil and gas, for example, being a particular example here, through to systemic risks. And central banks and financial regulators have started to think about this a lot in recent years. Considering how financial impacts caused by climate change risks could lead to contagion risks to the whole financial system. The Bank of England uses the example of a loan provider being exposed to counterparty credit default as a result of increased flood likelihood, and how through interbank lending that could lead to contagion risks to the whole financial system. So it's not just affecting particular entities, this is taking effect on a wide level. And now I'd like to just run through the types of risks and their financial impacts. So physical risks are probably what you think of most when you consider climate change. This is things which I mentioned earlier, such as extreme weather events and so on. The damage caused by extreme events is significant, not just in terms of their infrastructure impacts, but also their financial. Analysis by Swiss Re has stated that global GDP may be 10 to 14% less in a world without climate change compared to one in which it takes effect unchecked, and that even if the Paris Agreement targets were met, GDP would be around 4.2% less. So that means if we fail to act on this, we're looking at a 10% smaller global GDP by 2050. And we're already seeing impacts on business. So, for example, the UK heat wave this year, which also took effect across most of Europe, Imperial College researchers have found that was made much more likely as a result of climate change. And we saw impacts on worker productivity, transport affected, and wildfire events, which lead to things like insurance issues. So transition risks are the second category of risk I'd like to speak about. These are risks which businesses face as the result of changes to a net zero economy. I spoke earlier about the IPCC targets and the need to peak emissions by 2025 and achieve net zero by 2050, and that being reflected in the Paris Agreement. We're starting to see those now being reflected in government policy as well as in regulation. So as these developments arise, we can expect them to have increasing impacts on business models, and they're likely to happen. They could happen very quickly, and they can be quite significant. So some of the ones which have been suggested are immediate cessation of new fossil fuel developments, that's by the International Energy Agency, a prohibition on the sale of cars with internal combustion engines from 2035, that's again by the IEA, also by the IPCC and the PRI, and large-scale changes in agriculture and land use, that's again by the PRI. And we're starting to see these reflected in government policy. So the EU has a target for halting the sale of internal combustion engines by 2035, and the UK government has one by 2030. The other point to note on transition risk is that the speed and magnitude of them change depending on the timing. So if transition risks occur rapidly, we're likely to see a greater impact on companies. However, if they don't occur rapidly, we'd like to see greater physical risks over the medium and long term. So the UN Principle for Responsible Investment, which is a multinational network of investors, including some of the largest in the world, has a network called the initiative called the Inevitable Policy Response, and that publishes analysis on when it thinks transition risk policies are likely to come into effect. And what it's found is that the policy responses are likely to be forceful, abrupt, and disorderly, leaving financial portfolios exposed to significant transition risk, and think that this is likely to happen following the Paris stocktake at COP27 in 2023, coupled with increasing technological advances and the increasing reality of the physical effects of climate change towards 2025. So these are effects which we can expect to see over the next 2 to 3 years. Finally, I'll talk a bit about legal risks. So climate change litigation is now becoming increasingly prevalent. There are high-profile cases, so strategic cases where non-governmental organizations have taken high-emission companies to court, which have had some quite surprising and high-impact decisions. So on the slide, you'll see this is the case of the Milieu de France, which is a Dutch NGO, took Royal Dutch Shell to court, and the court decided that Royal Dutch Shell had to reduce the CO2 the Shell Group's the CO2 emissions of the Shell Group by 45% by 2030 relative to 2019 levels. That's obviously a massively far-reaching and impactful decision for the Shell Group, and it's one which they are having to put in place. But not all climate litigation is driven by NGOs. A lot of it doesn't even have the word climate in it, but is made more likely as a result of default risk, contractual risk, regulatory risk, which are made more likely as a result of climate change. So this example relates to the 2017 and 2018 wildfires in California, which are among the two most deadly and significant that we've seen so far. Climate change is likely to have been a factor in the conditions which led to the wildfires happening, but the wildfires themselves occurred as a result of regulatory breaches by PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric Company, which failed to maintain its equipment properly, leading to the wildfires. That led to massive fines for PG&E and drove it into insolvency, and multiple lawsuits from those affected by the fires. Then we had follow-on litigation from shareholders bringing claims against the directors for failing in their fiduciary duties to manage risk. So the point I want to make is that climate change litigation isn't just by strategic NGOs, it's also coming from business, coming from impacted communities, and coming from regulatory compliance issues. And investors, asset managers, need to be thinking about these as well. We've seen increasing regulatory interest in green issues over the last 12 months. We've seen advertising standards authorities taking banks to task over statements which they've made in consumer-facing advertisements. We've also seen financial regulators like the US Securities and Exchange Commission and the German BaFin investigate Deutsche Bank's asset management arm, Goldman Sachs, and fine BNY Mellon for mislabeling climate ESG funds and how they work. So these are risks which are particular to investors and which investors should be thinking about good practice in order to minimize. So what does all this mean in terms of fiduciary duty? So effectively, if climate change is a material financial risk, then good investment managers and good company directors need to be thinking about how to minimize that risk in order to act in the best interests of their beneficiaries and also to act with due care, skill and diligence. And those are the two main duties which I'm going to cover here. So what does fiduciary duty entail? As I've said, fiduciary duties requires acting in good faith in the best interests of the beneficiary to act for proper purposes and also to exercise due care, skill and diligence. This is generally the same in many jurisdictions around the world. I'm not a Guernsey lawyer, I should say, but I've taken these from the Guernsey fiduciary rules just to demonstrate that the way in which these fiduciary duties are structured are quite common. So what does thinking about climate change mean for ensuring that you're acting in the best interests of beneficiaries and acting with due care, skill and diligence? Well, the courts have started to make some assessments of this. We've not seen a court case go through properly, but here we've got 2 UK judges speaking extrajudicially, so this isn't part of a binding court judgment, but saying that directors' legal obligations need to be assessed in terms of the practical in terms of the general environment of expectation created by initiatives by regulators and in civil society. And there's also increased recognition by the global legal community that climate-related risks would be viewed by courts as reasonably foreseeable. So failing to consider climate-related risks may breach the duty of due care, skill and diligence. It may also fail to act, indicate a failure to act in the best interests of your beneficiaries as fiduciaries. And we've seen this understanding evolve over the last 15 years or so, in particular in relation to investor fiduciary duty. So on the slide, you'll see we've linked to 3 reports by the UNPRI, which is the organisation I mentioned earlier, and the law firm Freshfields Brookhouse Duringer. What we've seen in 2015, they concluded that investors who do not integrate financially material ESG factors into their analyses are not fulfilling their fiduciary duties. And going further in 2021, that investors are permitted to seek to achieve positive sustainability impacts in investing activities where those sustainability issues bear on their duties to pursue financial goals. So really just an extension of a reinterpretation of fiduciary duty to be clear that it involves considering material risks, including material climate risks. Fiduciaries who ignore risks that are not purely purely because they are climate related or sustainability related are likely to breach their fiduciary duties. And we've also seen this understanding start to evolve in the courts. Now, this is a UK case. It's also focused on a charitable investment fund, so it's particular to that set of facts, but it does illustrate how the changing interpretation of fiduciary duty is changing. In this case, UK trustees sought the court's views on whether they can invest in line with the Paris Agreement, recognising that there would likely be short-term financial detriment to the trust. And the court held that where you are investing in a vehicle which has a particular purpose, if classes of investment would conflict with that purpose, then trustees have a discretion to exclude investments which they feel would conflict with that purpose if they undertake a holistic assessment of all relevant factors, including financial factors. So if you have a particular purpose, if you're a green fund, then you can actually go further than simply considering ESG risks. You can start to filter out risks which conflict with your aims. I'd like to just finish by talking about how these duties are outlined in Guernsey. So the law is generally similar. It's focused on those key duties of acting in the best interests of your beneficiaries with due care, skill and diligence. The fiduciary rules, as I understand it, don't reference climate or the environment specifically, and this tallies with the Guernsey Financial Security Commission's statements that they don't think it's necessary to make specific rules about this. But it's very clear, if we look at the quotation in the bottom right, that they consider that licensees need to consider climate change risks in order to act in terms of their to act with due care, skill and diligence. We've also seen this in their amendment to the Financial Sector Code of Conduct in June last year, where they've included climate change as a particular climate change risk is a particular factor which boards should consider. And finally, just touching on two points in relation to Guernsey law, which may be of interest. As well as talking about risk and thinking about how to manage risks, there are also huge opportunities for funds and investors acting in this sphere. So the Guernsey Financial Services Commission has launched the groundbreaking Guernsey Green Fund, which requires member trusts to invest their property with the aim of spreading risk and the ultimate objective of mitigating environmental damage. So a certification process for Guernsey funds to demonstrate what their fiduciary duties and what their purpose is. We've also seen a new natural capital fund, which is being consulted on. I'd like to mention, I haven't focused on biodiversity risk throughout the presentation, but the understanding of climate change and fiduciary duties is rapidly evolving in relation to biodiversity risks as well. Biodiversity risks are increasingly being seen as a materially financial risk. The Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a collaboration of central banks, has reported on this, and this field is likely to evolve very, very rapidly in relation to this. So the Natural Capital Fund, which the Guernsey Financial Services Commission is consulting on, potentially a very interesting and valuable opportunity there. And finally, the Guernsey Trust Law allows for non-charitable trusts to have a purpose, a specific purpose. So this might, again, be a way for investors who want to invest for a positive impact to ensure that their fiduciary duties permit this by granting their fund a purpose to invest for. I'd just like to conclude by saying that this isn't the way in which, this isn't specific to Guernsey, this isn't specific to the UK, this is in fact how fiduciary duties are being interpreted increasingly around the world. And I've put up on the slide just a series of legal opinions and analyses which we and our partners have done relating to directors' duties and investor duties in this respect. So Guernsey is part of an increasing movement towards sustainable finance globally, and it's one which investors should certainly consider to ensure that they're meeting their legal duties. That brings me to the end of the presentation, and thank you very much.